Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes stepped into the bustling terminal of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, his polished boots clicking against the tiled floor. The air was thick with the usual airport chaos: families dragging suitcases, business travelers glued to their phones, children laughing as they ran ahead of exhausted parents. But for Hayes, this wasn't just another routine trip. Beneath his crisp Air Force uniform, there was a weight heavier than the ribbons and medals on his chest. In his hands, tucked carefully in a leather folder, were official orders from the Department of Defense, documents that authorized him to escort the remains of Private First Class Matthew Brooks back home. The real burden, however, wasn't the paperwork. It was the knowledge of what lay inside the flag-draped casket waiting on the tarmac. Hayes had never met Brooks in life, but that didn't matter. Duty didn't require familiarity, only commitment. He had escorted fallen soldiers before, had stood beside grieving families as they welcomed home the loved ones they had lost. It never got easier, but it was a responsibility he carried with honor. No soldier gets left behind. He adjusted his hat and exhaled, steadying himself before approaching the airline check-in counter. The line moved at a sluggish pace, passengers shifting impatiently as agents typed away at their keyboards. When it was finally his turn, he placed his military ID and travel orders on the counter with a quiet confidence. The woman behind the desk, Jessica Klein, barely glanced at him at first. She tapped a few keys on her screen, her brow furrowing slightly. Then she paused, too long for it to be routine. "Sir," she hesitated, her voice tight. I need to check something." Hayes gave a patient nod. He had dealt with bureaucratic delays before. But when Klein turned and whispered something to a nearby agent, then cast a quick, uncertain glance his way, a sense of unease settled in his chest. Something was wrong. A second airline employee stepped over, Mike Thompson, judging by the name tag pinned to his shirt. His expression was carefully neutral, but Hayes could see it, the flicker of hesitation, the stiffness in his stance. Then came the words Hayes never expected to hear. "Sir, I'm afraid we can't allow you to board this flight." The terminal's background noise faded. For the first time that day, Hayes felt something heavier than duty settle over him. Jessica Klein sat at the counter, typing methodically into the computer system. It was the same routine she had done hundreds of times before, checking in passengers, issuing boarding passes, and ensuring the flight was set to depart on schedule. The noise of the bustling airport was a constant hum around her, but she was used to it. For the most part, everything flowed like clockwork. But today was different. She had barely glanced up when Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes approached the counter, his crisp Air Force uniform standing in stark contrast to the usual travelers in jeans and t-shirts. She didn't think much of it at first. Military personnel were a common sight at airports, particularly in a hub as large as Dallas-Fort Worth. She processed his paperwork, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard, but then something caught her eye. His documents, his orders, the travel ID, everything was in order, but as her eyes scanned the system, something didn't sit right. A frown tugged at her brow. She double-checked the information, then checked it again, but there was no immediate explanation for the nagging doubt creeping into her mind. After a few moments of hesitation, she glanced up, meeting Hayes' steady gaze. "Sir, could you please hand me your documents again?" He extended the papers toward her, his face calm, giving nothing away. She took them, but her fingers trembled slightly as she took another look at the screen. She could feel the weight of his stare, the expectation that she would simply process this like any other passenger. But something wasn't adding up. She turned to the agent beside her, Kyle, a young man who was usually quick on his feet and knew the system well. He was typing into his own terminal, but she could see his eyes flicker toward her, curious, then cautious. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There's a problem with this ticket. I need to check something." Kyle didn't respond immediately, but after a moment, he nodded. Without another word, he tapped his supervisor on the shoulder and murmured something into his ear. The supervisor, Mike Thompson, a tall, middle-aged man with a stern expression, stood up and walked over. Hayes, still waiting with his hands folded in front of him, noticed the shift in the air. The usual noise from the line behind him seemed to quiet as the situation unfolded. He couldn't place it, but the tension in the air was palpable. People were beginning to notice, their eyes moving from the agent at the counter to him, then back to the agents, whispering softly among themselves. Thompson arrived at the counter, his face neutral but serious. He glanced at the computer screen before meeting Hayes' gaze. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience, but there seems to be an issue with your booking." Hayes' stomach tightened. He had traveled with military orders before, and this wasn't the first time he had escorted remains. He knew the procedure, and there had never been any issue with the tickets in the past. His voice remained steady, his military training kicking in as he asked, "What kind of issue?" Thompson cleared his throat. "It's a security protocol, sir. We're unable to allow you to board at this time." A cold ripple of confusion washed over Hayes. He'd heard the words before, but they didn't make sense. This wasn't just a civilian flight, this was a mission. It was an assignment from the military itself, with official orders and the solemn duty of escorting a fallen soldier home. Security protocol? Hayes repeated, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm escorting the remains of a soldier. The paperwork is in order, and I'm carrying official orders. What exactly is the issue here?" Thompson hesitated, looking at Hayes for a long moment before finally speaking again. "I'm afraid there's nothing we can do. It's just policy." Policy. The word hung in the air, heavier than it had any right to be. Hayes had been in too many tense situations to let frustration or anger take over, but this was different. This was about a fallen soldier. This was about showing respect to someone who had sacrificed everything for their country. The thought of being denied his duty because of some vague policy was enough to make his jaw tighten. Behind him, the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. People were starting to take notice. The line had come to a standstill, passengers now craning their necks, watching as the situation escalated. Hayes could feel their eyes on him, some out of curiosity, others with a growing sense of disbelief. A man in a business suit near the front of the line shifted uncomfortably, glancing back and forth between Hayes and the counter. A woman in a red jacket, holding her boarding pass, exchanged a confused look with her husband. They were all wondering the same thing. Why was a man in uniform being denied the chance to fulfill his duty? Hayes didn't move. He stood his ground, his posture rigid with the weight of the situation. He wasn't going anywhere without an answer. "I need to understand exactly what the issue is, sir," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "This is a military assignment. It's not personal. I have every right to be on that flight." Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by another voice from behind. A man in his mid-60s, dressed in a USMC cap and jacket, stepped forward. His face was weathered but his voice was clear, carrying the strength of someone who had served. "Hey, what's going on here?" the man asked, his tone growing firm. "This is a soldier, escorting another soldier home. Why are you giving him trouble?" Hayes glanced over at the Marine, and for the first time since this started, there was a glimmer of something more, something like support. The crowd behind him was starting to take sides, murmuring in agreement. The pressure on the airline staff was building. As Hayes stood there, waiting for a response, he realized this wasn't just about a flight. This was about something bigger, something everyone could see but no one seemed ready to confront. The question now wasn't just about why they were denying him a seat, but whether they would respect a soldier's right to fulfill his solemn duty. The air inside the terminal felt heavier now. The usual hum of boarding announcements and rolling suitcases had faded, replaced by a growing murmur as passengers in line began to take notice of what was happening at the check-in counter. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes stood tall, his uniform crisp, his expression calm but firm. He had just been told that he wouldn't be allowed to board his flight, a flight meant to take him and the remains of Private First Class Matthew Brooks back home. The words still echoed in his mind. Security protocol. It's just policy. It was nonsense. Hayes had flown dozens of times with military orders, just like these. There was no reason, no legitimate reason, why he should be denied this flight. And yet, here he was, being told that he couldn't do his duty. The passengers waiting behind him had been patient at first, but as the exchange dragged on, curiosity turned into concern. Then came the first voice. A deep, gravelly tone cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Excuse me, what the hell did I just hear?" Hayes turned his head slightly as an older man, Frank Miller, stepped forward from the line. His weathered face and the USMC cap pulled low over his brow left no doubt. This was a Marine, and not just any Marine, but a veteran who had seen more than his fair share of battles. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto the airline employees with a quiet intensity. "I've flown more times than I can count," Miller said, folding his arms. Asterisk asterisk, and I've never, asterisk asterisk not once, seen a policy that stops a soldier from escorting one of our own home. So I'm gonna ask again, what's the real reason? Jessica Klein, the airline agent, visibly tensed. Her hands hovered uncertainly over the keyboard as if she could somehow type her way out of the situation. She didn't look at Miller. She didn't look at Hayes. Instead, her eyes darted toward the back office, searching for support that wasn't coming. And then came the second voice. A middle-aged woman in a denim jacket, Linda Carter, standing a few feet away, tilted her head. In her hand, she held her phone, camera already rolling. "I'm sorry, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "They're not letting a soldier board his flight? A soldier who is literally escorting the remains of another soldier? Is that what's happening?" The volume of the murmurs grew. Passengers shifted in line. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others pulled out their phones, unlocking screens, opening camera apps. The tension at the counter thickened. Jessica swallowed hard. She wasn't a bad person. She was just an employee following what she had been told. But now she was beginning to realize something. This situation was spiraling out of control. And it wasn't just Hayes watching her anymore. It was everyone. A businessman in a suit leaned toward his colleague, whispering. A teenager in a hoodie lifted his phone, already recording. A young mother holding her child looked up from her boarding pass, frowning. Hayes remained still, observing. He wasn't doing anything to provoke this reaction, but he didn't have to. The Marine veteran, Miller, wasn't done yet. He took another step closer, fixing Jessica with a firm stare. "Ma'am, I suggest you check again," he said, his voice steady, but carrying the kind of authority that came from years in service. "Because what you're doing right now, it doesn't just look bad, it is bad." Jessica hesitated. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type anything. Then for the first time Mike Thompson, the airline supervisor, looked uneasy. The situation had gone from an isolated check-in dispute to something else entirely. The energy in the terminal had shifted. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a moment. People weren't just waiting for their flights. They were waiting for an answer. Jessica turned slightly toward Thompson, as if silently pleading for him to step in and take control. But he didn't move. He only adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and avoided eye contact with the cameras now pointed in his direction. Hayes, standing at the center of it all, knew exactly what was happening. The airline had miscalculated. They had thought they could dismiss this as a minor inconvenience, that they could send him away with an empty apology and vague talk about policy. They were wrong. The crowd wasn't having it. Someone in the back muttered, "This is ridiculous." Another voice chimed in, "Why are they making this so difficult?" Then in the distance, a young woman gasped, eyes locked onto her phone screen. "Oh my God," she whispered, showing it to the man next to her. "It's already trending." Hayes didn't move, didn't react, but deep down he knew. This was far from over. The murmur of the crowd had turned into something more, a charged atmosphere, an unspoken consensus that what was happening wasn't right. And then, almost like a spark igniting dry grass, the first ripple of outrage went online. Ethan Walker, a young man in his early 20s, had been standing a few rows behind in line, watching the situation unfold with growing disbelief. He wasn't a veteran. He didn't come from a military family. But even he knew this was wrong. His thumbs flew over his phone screen as he quickly crafted a tweet. Air Force officer denied flight while escorting remains of soldiers. What are we doing to those who serve our country? The second he hit post, he refreshed the page. Within 30 seconds, the first few likes appeared. Then came the retweets. 1, 2, 5, 10. Within minutes, the numbers climbed into the hundreds. Passengers around him, already filming the confrontation, began posting their own videos, their own captions. This is disgraceful. This airline just prevented a military officer from carrying out his duties. I can't believe this. He has military orders. He's escorting a fallen soldier home. Why is this happening? Spread this. People need to see it. #LetHimFly. At first, Jessica Klein and Mike Thompson were too focused on the growing tension at the counter to realize what was happening online. But it didn't take long. A flight attendant passing by glanced at her phone and sucked in a sharp breath. "Holy," she muttered before catching herself. She nudged a coworker. "Check Twitter." Mike's phone vibrated in his pocket, a message flashing across his screen. He pulled it out, unlocking it absent-mindedly, and then froze. There it was. A firestorm brewing in real time. Hundreds of retweets. Thousands of comments. The #LetHimFly hashtag climbing the trending list. His face paled. Jessica, still standing behind the counter, caught sight of his expression and frowned. What? Mike didn't answer. He just turned the screen toward her. Jessica inhaled sharply. The videos. The tweets. The growing fury online. She suddenly understood something. They had completely underestimated this situation. And then, just as reality started to sink in, a voice cut through the terminal. "I'm not flying with this airline anymore. This is disgusting." The shout came from an older woman, somewhere off to the side. Her voice rang out, clear and sharp, carrying over the restless murmurs of the crowd. More voices joined in. "This is how they treat our soldiers. Unbelievable. I'll book another airline right now." Passengers weren't just standing by anymore. They were reacting. Jessica swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter. This wasn't just an argument with one passenger anymore. This was a public relations nightmare spiraling out of control, and they were at the center of it. Mike exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. He had handled customer disputes before. He had even dealt with the occasional angry veteran demanding better treatment. But this was a disaster in the making. As if to make matters worse, Ethan Walker's phone buzzed again. He glanced down at the screen, his eyes widening. His tweet had just been shared by a major military news page. "Guys," he muttered under his breath. "This is blowing up." Nearby, a younger woman gasped, clutching her phone. "It's already trending on Facebook." Jessica and Mike locked eyes, both thinking the same thing. This isn't going away. They had assumed this would be a minor issue, a simple case of following corporate policies, enforcing a rule, keeping everything professional. But they had failed to realize something crucial. This wasn't just about a flight. This was about respect. About how a nation treated its soldiers. About whether or not the people who risked their lives in service of their country could expect basic human decency in return. And now, the entire country was about to find out. The atmosphere in the terminal had shifted from tense curiosity to outright indignation. The passengers, once just silent onlookers, were now fully engaged. Cameras remained fixed on the confrontation, recording every moment as the situation spiraled beyond the airline's control. Jessica Klein and Mike Thompson were out of their depth, and they knew it. This was no longer just a problem at the check-in counter. This was a PR disaster unfolding in real time. And now, the corporate reinforcements had arrived. Through the growing crowd, a man in a tailored navy blue suit strode forward, exuding the calm but controlled presence of someone accustomed to putting out fires. His airline ID, clipped neatly to his pocket, read David Nolan, Senior Operations Manager. He was here to fix this. Colonel Hayes, I apologize for the inconvenience, Nolan began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. I understand this is an unfortunate misunderstanding, and I want to personally make this right. Hayes didn't move. He had spent too many years dealing with bureaucratic doublespeak to be impressed by a carefully worded corporate script. Nolan gestured toward a nearby agent, who quickly began typing into the system. We've arranged for you to be upgraded to first class, free of charge. He smiled as if that should settle everything. We hope this can accommodate you properly for your journey. A few murmurs spread through the crowd. Some looked at Hayes, waiting for his response. Others shook their heads, seeing this for what it was, a weak attempt to smooth things over without addressing the real issue. Hayes, standing tall in his uniform, did not blink. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but unyielding. I don't need first class. I need to complete my mission. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Nolan hesitated. The well-rehearsed corporate approach wasn't working. Hayes took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Nolan's. And I need to know why I was denied my flight in the first place. For the first time since stepping into the conversation, Nolan faltered. His confident demeanor wavered, just slightly, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. He didn't have a real answer. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People weren't satisfied with a first-class upgrade. They wanted accountability. A woman in the back called out, her voice sharp. Tell him the truth. Why was he denied? A man near the front folded his arms, shaking his head. First class? You think this is about a better seat? Give me a break. Hayes wasn't alone anymore. The crowd was with him. Nolan inhaled sharply, trying to keep control of the situation. Sir, again, I sincerely apologize for the miscommunication. We are working to resolve this. Miscommunication. Hayes interrupted. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it was firm enough to stop Nolan mid-sentence. That's not what happened here. A miscommunication is when you get someone's coffee order wrong. Hayes's voice did not waver. This was a decision. Someone looked at my paperwork, saw my orders, and still told me I wasn't allowed to board. I want to know why. The crowd erupted in agreement. More voices rose, backing him up. He's right. That wasn't a mistake, that was a choice. Tell us the real reason. Nolan's polished demeanor continued to crack. The crowd had turned into something more dangerous than an inconvenience. They had turned into witnesses. Jessica, still standing behind the counter, looked at Mike Thompson, the supervisor who had originally denied Hayes' flight. Her hands trembled slightly. She hadn't questioned the decision at first. It was just a policy, right? A security measure, nothing personal. But now, as the weight of the moment pressed down on her, she wasn't sure anymore. Had she just followed orders? Or had she been complicit in something worse? Nolan could feel the moment slipping from his grasp. He needed to end this conversation before it spiraled further. His voice dropped into a more authoritative tone, trying one last time to regain control. Colonel Hayes, I assure you, we are doing everything possible to rectify this situation. If you'll allow us, we'd like to personally escort you to your gate so you can continue your mission. Hayes didn't move. He wasn't going to be escorted out like some VIP to make this problem disappear. He wasn't going to let them rewrite this story on their terms. He let the silence stretch for a moment, then, finally, he spoke. And if no one had spoken up? Nolan blinked, clearly not expecting the question. Hayes took a slow step forward. If no one had recorded this, if no one had posted about it online, if the passengers around me hadn't stood up, would I still be standing here? Or would I still be denied my flight? The question hung in the air like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. For the first time, Nolan had no answer. The crowd wasn't just angry anymore. They were disappointed. They had seen how this played out in real time. They had watched it escalate, watched the airline scramble to save face. And now, they all knew the truth. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about a security measure. This was about getting caught. And the worst part? If no one had spoken up, nothing would have changed. Nolan sighed heavily. He had lost control of the narrative. And the airline? They had just made the wrong kind of headlines. The tension in the terminal had reached its peak. The murmur of the crowd was no longer just a restless hum. It was charged with expectation, waiting for the next move. The airline had fumbled its attempts at damage control, and now, they had lost control of the situation entirely. And then, the military arrived. Through the main entrance of the terminal, 3 figures strode in with purpose and authority. Leading them was Major Samuel Carter, a seasoned officer from the Department of Defense, his uniform crisp and his posture rigid with discipline. On either side of him were 2 military police officers, their presence a silent but undeniable statement. This was no longer a civilian matter. The energy in the terminal shifted immediately. Passengers moved aside instinctively, sensing that something important was happening. Some lowered their phones slightly, not out of disinterest, but because the presence of military authority commanded a different kind of attention. Major Carter did not hesitate. He marched directly to the airline counter, stopping just a few feet from David Nolan, the senior operations manager who had just tried to salvage the situation. For the first time since stepping in, Nolan looked visibly shaken. The weight of the moment, the realization of what was happening, settled in. This wasn't just bad PR anymore. This was the U.S. military stepping in because of a mistake his airline had made. Major Carter's voice was firm, unwavering. "We received the report. Colonel Hayes doesn't need to fly with your airline anymore." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Nolan blinked, his mouth opening slightly as if to respond, but nothing came out. Carter continued, his voice cool and professional, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The Pentagon has arranged for a military transport. His flight is no longer your concern." Hayes, standing tall beside the counter, processed the words in silence. He had expected a battle, a continued fight to ensure that he could carry out his mission. He had been prepared to stand his ground until there was no other choice. But this? This was the military making it clear that they would not allow one of their own to be treated this way. And for the airline? This was the worst possible outcome. Because this wasn't just about one officer being denied a flight anymore. This was about an airline making the wrong kind of enemy. Nolan, still frozen in place, finally found his voice. It was weak, uncertain. "Major Carter, I can assure you, this was all just a miscommunication." Carter didn't let him finish. "You were given multiple opportunities to correct your mistake." The Major's expression remained unreadable, but his words carried an unmistakable warning. "You failed." Jessica Klein, still behind the counter, looked like she wanted to disappear. Mike Thompson stood rigid, as if the reality of what they had done had only now truly set in. This wasn't fixable anymore. This wasn't something an apology could smooth over. They had denied a decorated officer his duty. They had forced a confrontation that should never have happened. And now, the U.S. military was stepping in to ensure it never happened again. Hayes adjusted his hat, his expression unreadable. He had fought battles in war zones before, but today, he had fought a different kind of battle, one against bureaucracy, negligence, and indifference. And thanks to those who stood up and refused to be silent, he had won. The murmurs from the crowd weren't just of shock anymore. They were of admiration. Someone whispered, "Damn right." Another muttered, "That's how you handle things." In the back, Ethan Walker refreshed his phone. His tweet had just surpassed 50,000 shares. The videos, the outrage, the demand for justice, it had spread like wildfire. Nolan, now visibly sweating, tried to regain his footing. "Major, surely there's a way we can rectify." Carter's gaze hardened. "This will be addressed." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And with that, he turned to Hayes. "Colonel, let's get you where you need to be." Hayes gave one last look at the counter, at the faces of the airline employees who had tried to dismiss him until it was too late. Then, he turned and walked away. And just like that, the battle at the airport was over. For the airline, however, the war was just beginning. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within hours of the incident at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, the videos taken by passengers had spread across social media like wildfire. Let Him Fly was no longer just a trending topic, it had become a national conversation. News outlets wasted no time picking up the story. By midnight, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and every major network had run a segment on what had happened. The images of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes standing firm in his uniform, the military police escorting him away from the airline counter, and the airline staff scrambling to explain themselves were played over and over again. Anchors and commentators debated the implications. How does something like this even happen? Have we forgotten how to treat our service members with dignity? This is about more than just a flight. This is about respect. By the next morning, veterans advocacy groups had released statements condemning the airline. Several high-profile retired generals took to social media, expressing their outrage and calling for serious repercussions. Then came the financial hit. By the end of the week, the airline stock had plummeted nearly 15%. Investors saw the backlash brewing and knew that public trust was shattering. Customers flooded the airline's social media pages with furious comments, demanding explanations. Some even posted screenshots of their canceled bookings, vowing never to fly with them again. The hashtag boycott airline started gaining traction, compounding the company's PR nightmare. But the worst was yet to come. It wasn't just public outcry anymore, it was legal. Within days, a coalition of military advocacy groups filed a formal complaint against the airline. The lawsuit alleged discrimination and failure to uphold service member protections, citing federal laws that guarantee active-duty military personnel priority boarding and travel accommodations when on orders. Legal analysts on news networks debated whether the airline could face federal penalties for what had happened. Lawyers representing veterans announced that they were exploring further legal action. The company's board of directors was in full-blown crisis mode. By the time the CEO finally stepped in to do damage control, it was already too late. In a hastily arranged press conference, he stood at a podium, flanked by company executives, and read from a carefully worded statement. "We deeply regret the unfortunate incident involving Lieutenant Colonel Hayes and are conducting a full internal review of our policies and procedures to ensure that this does not happen again." The words felt hollow, rehearsed, too corporate to mean anything. Then, the fatal misstep. A reporter in the front row raised a hand. "Does your company take full responsibility for this situation?" The CEO hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. That brief pause, that flicker of doubt, was all the confirmation people needed. This wasn't an apology. This was damage control. And no one was buying it. The outrage didn't fade, it grew. The airline announced that the employees involved had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review. But for the public, that wasn't justice. It was an excuse. For days, veterans and military families flooded the airline's customer service lines, demanding answers. The company's marketing team scrambled, trying to shift focus onto discounted fares and promotional deals, but nothing worked. Because no one was ready to move on. This wasn't just about one soldier being denied a flight. It was about how America treated its warriors. It was about whether people would accept empty apologies or demand real accountability. And in this case, the people had spoken. For the airline, the damage was done. In life, there are moments when we are called to stand, not for ourselves, but for what is right. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes' story is not just about a flight. It is about honor, respect, and the responsibility we all share to uphold justice. Too often, we assume that someone else will speak up, that someone else will fight the battle. But what happens when no one does? Would Hayes have completed his mission if not for the voices that refused to be silent? Would justice have been served if the public hadn't held those in power accountable? This is the reality of our world today. Truth does not always prevail unless we fight for it. And respect, especially for those who serve and sacrifice, should never be conditional. It should not depend on whether a video goes viral or whether public pressure forces the right outcome. It should be the standard. So, what can we take from this? Never stay silent in the face of wrongdoing. Never assume your voice doesn't matter. Because when people unite for a just cause, no institution, no corporation, and no system can ignore them. And that is how real change happens.